The Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab is with us now on The Morning. Breaking news, inflation hits 9.1%, highest rate for 40 years. Mr Raab, how are you going to square this circle of inflation and rising wage claims? Margaret Thatcher did it, love her or loathe her, presumably you love her. She did it, eventually, by raising taxes and slashing public spending. Made her very unpopular in some quarters, very popular in others, but it did sort the problem. Is that what you lot are going to have to do?
Good morning, Richard. Well, look, first of all, we understand the difficulties that families and workers across the country will be going through this year. Inflation is forecast to come down next year, but it's going to be a very difficult time. And we've got a £37 billion package to try and provide support for the most vulnerable, whether it's with energy bills, whether it's the lowest paid in work through the extra £1,000 on universal credit, whether it's the national living wage rise, an extra £1,000. So we're targeting the support, and it's a huge amount going in. At the same time, we will need wage restraint, which is really difficult. And the reason we'll need it, for example, in the context of strikes and the railway workers, is that if we gave in to the union's demands for 7% rather than 3% increase, what you'll see is a vicious cycle of inflation going up, and that will make inflation stay higher for longer, and that will only hurt the most vulnerable. They're the ones that would lose. So we do need that financial discipline when it comes to public sector and broader pay and wage restraint.
But you haven't quite answered the question, which was, would you tread the path that Margaret Thatcher trod? Because it did, like it or love it, or loathe it, it did work. Would you raise taxes and slash public spending like she did?
Well, look, we've certainly want to make sure we're fiscally responsible. I don't think the two contexts are exactly analogous, but I understand why you put it to us. We're going to take an approach which is right and fit to the circumstances and the lives and the challenges that people across the country are feeling today. And I've just given you the two aspects. One, which is this enormous package of tailored support for the most vulnerable. Secondly, making sure that we do not allow the vicious cycle of inflation to make matters worse, which is the real risk. I mean, I understand why unions will ask for and want to protect and champion their workers. That's absolutely legitimate. But, of course, the risk of spiralling inflation, and that can be driven by increases in wages, is that inflation stays higher for longer. And we've got to make sure that that doesn't happen and that inflation does indeed come back next year. And then the other thing, finally, is just the fundamentals of the economy. Unemployment at record lows, lowest since I was born, actually in 1974, and the investment coming into the country from venture capital to tech investment, which does two things: creates the well-paid jobs that we need, but also provides the tax revenue to provide that support that is so critical at this time.
What can you do to make the energy market a bit more competitive? There have been 28 energy firms that have collapsed, I think, in the last year, which obviously then means that we've got this energy price cap coming again in October, which is really going to hit inflation again, because I think that is, as you'll agree, that is the main driver, isn't it, of the problem? It's the price of energy, and energy is used for absolutely everything that we do, whether it's business, whether it's farming, whether it's in your own home. But there's not enough competition, is there? So we're all sort of trapped with our energy suppliers, and the market is getting smaller. Can you do anything there?
I think it's a really good point. Look, the first thing we ought to do is become more energy self-reliant, which is why the new modular nuclear power is so important, along with renewable technology. But we've got to do that in a sensible way, which is why relying on North Sea oil and gas is part of the transition. So that's very important. Of course, we've only got 3% reliance on, for example, Russian gas, much lower than continental economies, but we need to go further in that regard. In relation to the state of the sector, I started off life as a competition lawyer. I think you make some good points, and the business secretary is undertaking a review, and the CMA, the body charged, is reviewing that. There's one particular issue that I think is right to laser in on now, both as a matter of the health of the market, but also consumers, is the extent to which drops in the price of energy get passed on to retailers at the pumps. And that's something, again, that we're taking forward.
OK, you talk about wage restraint. We had Lord Ed Vaizey on the show a couple of hours ago, and he said that it's all about leadership by example now. We're all in the same boat. And he was suggesting that CEOs and big boss figures in the UK should be voluntarily taking a pay freeze and not awarding themselves the big rises that so many do. They should be setting an example. So if you say to the workers, basically, sorry, you can't have the rate of inflation, the bosses say the same thing to themselves and make that public. What do you think about that?
I think for those that want to show corporate leadership, that would set a powerful example. But ultimately, we're not going to, beyond the measures and the regulatory regime we've got in place, start micromanaging that. I think that would be a distraction for what...
You could call on them, couldn't you? You could call on them to do it. In the same way as just now you've called upon the workers of this country to show wage restraint, you could call upon the bosses of this country to do the same thing.
I think that wage restraint is going to be something which, across the public and private sector, we need to show across the board, and I don't want it to become divisive. We're all in this together, but some will absolutely be disproportionately affected, particularly the poorest in our society. But we know that if wage demands go up, whether that's fueled by the public or the private sector, then inflation will stay higher for longer, and that hits the poorest.
So when this letter goes in from the National Education Union to Nadhim Zahawi asking for potentially a 12% pay rise, is that just it's a flat no and it will be strikes? I mean, that's essentially where we're heading for them, possibly doctors and nurses. Postal Workers Union is now thinking about it. Civil servants, you know, people that possibly work in your departments may well be thinking the same thing. We are going to grind to a halt, are we, at some point, when it comes to people asking for more money and getting nothing in return?
Well, I hope not, because, of course, strikes don't make the economic situation any easier to handle, nor do they help us deal with this issue around a vicious cycle of inflationary wage demands fueling higher inflation, which just makes the problem worse.
Well, you say they don't work, but there are fresh talks, aren't there, between the RMT and the employer today? So there must be something going on. There must be some more money around to try and persuade the RMT to go forward with some modernisations in return. There must be. Otherwise, what's the point of the talks? Well,
I think it's always worth talking to see if we can avoid the disruptive effect. But just to take RMT, there's a 16 billion package of support that went into helping the rail sector and rail workers through the pandemic. Just to give you a sense of what the taxpayer, your viewers, would have been coughing up for that, £600 per household. I don't think it's the right thing, having had that support from the taxpayer and government, for them to be engaged in these strikes, not least because, not just because the effect it has on the public, although I think that many of your viewers will be concerned about that, but actually what it will do for those workers. I want to protect the salaries, the purchasing power of the salaries of the most vulnerable in our society, and giving in to those wage demands makes it much tougher to do that.
Just a few days ago, it seems longer now, but just a few days ago, 148 Conservative MPs showed that they had absolutely no confidence in the Prime Minister. It wasn't a good... Yes, he won the vote of no confidence, but it wasn't a good result. And everybody said, wait and see what happens with the by-elections. Now, they're taking place tomorrow, and the polls aren't looking good for Mr Johnson or your party. If you lose at Wakefield, and if you lose at the other one, I mean, what's his response going to be? And what's the pressure from the backbenchers, the 148, going to be on him?
Well, look, we'll fight hard to win those by-elections. I've been to both those constituencies, great local candidates fighting very hard. We think we've got a better, positive message. But look, if by-elections are notoriously precarious for an incumbent government, particularly mid-term, but we're getting on with the job. And I think whether it's tackling the cost of living plan, with the plan that we've got, a concerted plan, whether it's showing leadership on the strike action. Keir Starmer has been all over the place. Half his front bench have either been expressing their support or been out on picket lines with the strikers, notwithstanding that he's been very evasive but said he doesn't, that he is on the side of passengers. I think he's shown his leadership there, and I think we'll keep, whether it's on the cost of living, whether it's on strikes, whether it's on the war in Ukraine, we'll keep pointing out that actually, when it comes to the big calls and the tough decisions, the Prime Minister and this government is getting these things right in difficult circumstances.
Before you go, Dominic Raab, not the small matter of you introducing the British Bill of Rights into the House today, which would supersede the kind of judgment that grounded the Rwanda flight from the European Court of Human Rights. The Law Society of England and Wales says that your bill will create an acceptable class of human rights abuses in the UK.
Well, the Law Society is saying that without having seen the bill, which will be published at lunchtime. So I struggle with critics who haven't yet seen the text. What we'll do is strengthen, reinforce the proud tradition of liberty and free speech we have in this country, which I think was very well illustrated by the debate you had on before. We need that rambunctious debate. It has been whittled away by the Human Rights Act in various different ways, judge-made privacy law, if you like, the excessive political correctness that has stifled the room for debate. I think we need to make that room greater.
Debate, Dominic
and
Raab.
secondly...
Are you talking about our fat suit debate, which you must have been listening to? Is that what you mean?
And it was fascinating. I enjoyed hearing both sides. On the other hand, we also want to curb the abuses of human rights with foreign national offenders trumping deportation on the most elastic versions of the right to family life and re-inject some common sense into the system. I think there's a common sense reform that most people would like to see.
All right, Mr. Raab, well, we won't ask if you're in a fat suit this morning, because it doesn't look as if you are. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
The judo champion is Dominic Raab.
Yes.